Hi, everyone. My name is Paul. Welcome to the Stormkeep.
Your co-storm host, JJ.
Co-Storm host. I like that. That's pretty good. So today we're going to be talking about Cycle of the Storm. I know that we mentioned that our next video was going to be about lists, but it seems like this topic has come up recently on our Discord, and it has kind of just taken over my thoughts for the last 2 days or so. And the reason it's so important, I hope you'll understand by the end of this episode. So let's talk about what Cycle of the Storm did in 2nd edition. It was an ability that you could find on every Lord Arcanum War scroll that said, once per turn, when a friendly Stormcast Eternals model is slain within 18 inches of this model, instead of removing the slain model, you can heal 1 wound allocated to it. This model cannot use this ability on itself. And that was pretty cool. It didn't see a lot of play. It kind of just saved you a wound every now and then. And how that interacted with the rules in particular, you can see here. I'm not going to read these out verbatim. Everybody knows how it worked in 2nd edition. What matters is what's changed. So let's take a look at a practical example of how this worked in 2nd edition. Let's say a unit, we'll call it Attacker, is targeting a unit called Defender, which has 5 models with 2 wounds apiece. So like a typical unit of Liberators, right? The first thing you do is you roll an attack sequence. You make your hit rolls, you make your wound rolls, and you make your save rolls. And let's say, I don't know, it doesn't really matter what number we pick, but let's say the unit suffers 12 wounds. So far, so good. Everybody follows this part. You have to allocate these wounds 1 at a time to each model. So the first model there in the top left gets allocated a wound, and 11 wounds remain to be allocated. Then that model is allocated another wound, and it's slain. At this point, Cycle of the Storm activates when the model is slain and interrupts wound allocation. This model is healed for a wound at this point. It interrupts the normal process of putting wounds on models 1 at a time, revives the model, and heals it a wound. You following me so far, JJ?
Yeah, no, this is pretty standard stuff.
Okay. So then at that point, you go back into wound allocation. The Defender allocates another wound to the healed model, and they have 9 left to allocate. That model is slain and a second time, and at this point, it's removed from play. If you don't have another cycle effect, it would just get removed from play normally. And then you proceed allocating the other 9 wounds, which is enough to kill the rest of the Liberators. Now, how this ability works in 3rd edition is that once per turn, if a friendly Stormcast Eternals model is slain within 18 inches, instead of removing that model from play, you heal a wound allocated to that model, and it does not count as having been slain. There's some key differences in the wording there, along with differences in the rules, that make this ability work differently, and I would say it's much, much stronger now. So the first key difference is that this ability doesn't activate when the model is slain. It activates if a friendly model is slain and when you try to remove that model from play. The timing is a little bit different, and you'll understand why it needs to be different because the core rules have changed. The second key difference is that the model does not count as having been slain, and this is also necessary just for this rule to work in general. So let's take a look at what actually changed in the core rules of how you allocate wounds. So section 14.1 says, wounds are allocated to models in a unit 1 at a time. You can allocate wounds caused to your units as you see fit. However, once you have allocated a wound to a model, you cannot allocate wounds to other models in the unit until that model is slain. And in 14.2 talks about slain models. It says, once the number of wounds allocated to a model equals its wound characteristic, that model is slain and you cannot allocate any more wounds to it. A slain model is removed from play after all of the wounds caused to its unit have been allocated and all attacks that inflicted damage on the unit have been resolved. So I'm going to quickly flip back to the previous one. And we can see here there's some key differences in terms of allocating wounds and slain models. In 2nd edition, when you allocated wounds, you would immediately slay the model as soon as it reached an equal number of wounds to its wound characteristic. So in our example here, the model is slain at this point when this model takes 2 damage, and it's removed at this exact point as well. That has changed in 3rd edition. Instead, you have to wait until all of the wounds have been allocated, and then you start removing models. So 3 big key differences. Slain models are not removed immediately, only after all the wounds are allocated. Since models are not removed immediately, they had to add a clause that says you can't allocate any more wounds to a slain model. That clause didn't exist before. And it's something they removed from the 2nd edition rules, is that there's nothing prohibiting multiple wounded models in a unit. Previously, there actually had a specific clause in the 2nd edition rules that said no unit can have more than 1 model wounded at a time. Something to that effect. So how do you put all these pieces together? Let's take a look at a practical example, a really simple one, just one model, and we'll make it a big model too. We'll make it a Star Drake. So let's say Defender is one model with 18 wounds. You do your attack sequence again. You make your hit rolls, your wound rolls, and your save rolls. And let's say I just picked a ridiculously high number here. The defending unit suffers 81 wounds, and our Star Drake is not very happy about that. So 18 wounds are allocated one at a time, and the model reaches the number of wounds it would take to slay it. 63 wounds remain to be allocated. Based on the new rules, the remaining damage is completely negated because you can't apply any more wounds because the model is slain, and there are no other models in the unit. So far, so good?
Yep.
Okay. Since there's no other wounds to be allocated, as per section 14.2, the model can be removed from play. However, little side note here, if you're playing Stormcast Eternals, Blaze of Glory activates at this step before you remove the model. You roll the number to determine the number of mortal wounds. Then, once you try to remove the model, Cycle of the Storm activates, the model is not slain, and it heals a wound. So what's the practical impact here? In second edition, and you allocate the wounds. I put a note here about Blaze of Glory. So in second edition, models would die, immediately get revived by Cycle, and then overkill damage would spill over and kill them again. In third edition, models die, overkill damage is negated, and then the model is revived with 1 health remaining. So effectively, this allows a Stormcast unit to survive an infinite amount of damage from a single attack. It doesn't matter how much damage you would take. If the damage would kill you, all overkill damage is negated, and you survive with 1 health, thanks to Cycle of the Storm. Now, Cycle of the Storm only works once per turn, so you can still die if you're attacked again in the same turn. If they charge you with 2 different units, or if they shoot you with 2 different units, or if they have some kind of ability that deals mortal wounds at the start of a phase, and then they attack you and deal the last one they kill you. But this is a huge change that really changes the value of a lot of the Lord Arcanum units. In particular, having multiple Lord Arcanum units is really, really valuable now, because now it would take an opponent 3 separate activations to kill a model through 2 Cycle of the Storm. And healing is a lot more valuable, which means the Lord Arcanum on Griff Charger is a lot better. A teleporting, healing Cycle of the Storm is suddenly good. Life Swarm is a lot better. The Relictor just keeps getting better. Revival effects are more valuable because you're more likely to keep a unit around. Before, if your unit of, let's say, 5 Retributors was wiped out, now with Cycle of the Storm, you'd have 1 model surviving, and Yundrasta could resurrect a 2nd model. And there's no limit on the number of times you can activate Blaze of Glory in a turn. So if you die 3 times in the same turn, and you get cycled back each time, you can roll Blaze of Glory each time, and all the mortal wounds happen at the end of the phase. Other combos that I could see with this is that Karazai heals himself as he kills things, so even if he dies, he gets cycled back, and then he can attack and maybe heal some wounds there. Bastion, in particular, seems really good with this because of his ability to fully heal himself at the end of a combat phase if he killed any models. I think that's an excellent ability. But it seems a little weird. There's some weirdness. JJ, do you have any questions so far before we get to the weirdness? Is this all making sense to you?
Yeah, no, I'm following. The only interaction that I'd want to clarify on is with Only the Faithful, because we have a lot of Hollow Strike players in our Discord group.
Only the Faithful is a little bit different. Blaze of Glory says that it occurs before you remove the model. Cycle of the Storm tries to occur when you try to remove the model. But Hallowed Knights Only the Faithful says, if a friendly Hallowed Redeemer's unit is slain within 3 inches of an enemy unit, roll a dice. On a 4+, that model can fight before it's removed from play. So this one's a little bit different. It activates when the model is slain, because that's the instant when you roll the dice, not when you try to remove the model. On a 4+, you can fight before it's removed, so it's a little weird. So you roll the dice when the model is slain, but then before you remove the model, you do that. So that happens at the exact same moment as Blaze. So how it would work is you allocate the wounds, the model is slain, you roll for Only the Faithful, then you go into removing the models. That's the point where you would roll for both Blaze of Glory, and you would attack with Only the Faithful if you rolled a 4+, and then you try to do Cycle of the Storm. So you can do both effects. You just have to make sure you do Cycle of the Storm last. That's the key here. Because Cycle of the Storm says the model is not slain.
Yeah, so key takeaways I'm getting is that when we're doing these types of Cycle of the Storm combos, we still have to be mindful of our sort of order of execution. And on top of that, when it comes to single models right now, when a model is slain, or before a model is slain, we stop allocating overkill to it, basically.
Yeah, overkill is just gone because there's nothing to allocate it to. Now, the rules specifically don't state what happens to overkill damage at this particular point, but there's no other thing that could possibly happen to it because there's no models that it could be applied to, because you can't apply more wounds to a slain model. So even without Cycle of the Storm, if you're just looking at a scenario where a 5 wound model is attacked and takes 6 damage, and there's 1 overkill, like that overkill is just wasted, right? If it has to be. So even though the rules don't specify, you can infer that has to be the case. Otherwise, the game wouldn't function.
Yeah, so, I say let's get into the situation where we get out of 1 model units then.
Well, let me just double check to make sure we understand how this works here, right? So you get attacked, you allocate the wounds, right? Any overkill is negated, and then after you check the model, so the model is slain, you negate all the overkill, then you remove the model. It happens in that particular order because of the core rules. Then, since you're removing the model after all the damage, all the overkill is gone, you revive with 1 health. So let's look at what happens if you end up with that same Liberator unit we had there, the Defender unit. Let's say you only take 5 wounds this time, and we're talking about 3rd edition here, not 2nd edition. So we go through allocating wounds 1 at a time. The model there takes 1 wound, then it takes another one, and it counts as slain. But it is not removed immediately. You keep allocating wounds. The second model is allocated 2 wounds in the exact same way that first one is. There's still 1 wound left to allocate, so we just apply it to another model. Doesn't matter which ones we're applying it to in this case. So in this case, we have 2 slain models and 1 model that has been allocated a wound. Since there are no more wounds to be allocated, the slain models are now removed at this part. And now that you're trying to remove a model, Cycle of the Storm activates. When you try to remove a slain model, Cycle of the Storm heals that model for a wound and claims that model is not slain. The other model gets removed from play, because let's say we only had 1 Cycle of the Storm, but now you're left with a unit that has 2 wounded models. And this is the first time in Age of Sigmar that this has been possible, that you can have 2 different wounded models. There used to be a rule that said you couldn't do this. That rule is gone. So what happens now? This is the weird part. This is not a problem, though, because there is no rule that says you can't have 2 wounded models. So the particular wording of section 14.1 says, once you have allocated a wound to a model, you cannot allocate wounds to other models until that model is slain. In this case, Defender number 2 in the top right was slain. So therefore, section 14.1 is satisfied, and you don't need to allocate wounds to him anymore. Any model that's revived or not slain by Cycle of the Storm, you do not have to allocate wounds to them anymore, because the condition has been satisfied. The next wound that happens to this unit has to go to Defender number 3 in the bottom left, since he was allocated a wound previously and has not yet been slain. So what happens after Defender number 3 is slain? Section 14.1 only governs what happens once you allocate a wound to a model, and it ends when that model is slain. Since Defender 2 was slain, condition satisfied, and you don't have to apply wounds to him. And nothing in the rule says you must allocate wounds to a wounded model. So if Defender 1 and Defender 3 are removed, you do not have to allocate wounds to Defender 2. You can allocate wounds to any model in the unit. And this is very strange. No ability in the game has worked like this before. Are you following what I'm saying, or is this a little too technical?
No, it makes sense. It just puts it in a weird spot with wound allocation now.
It is. It's going to be a little weird. I've looked through the rules, and I don't think this breaks anything with healing, right? Like, you don't double up your healing all of a sudden because you're healing 1 wound at a time, just like you allocate 1 wound at a time. In terms of a unit being wounded, maybe there's some special abilities that might interact with that. I don't think there's any ability that interacts per wounded model within a certain range. If there is, that ability becomes more useful against Cycle of the Storm in this scenario. I would assume it's a very marginal gain. But everything that I've laid out here is consistent with the rules as they're written. So this version of Cycle of the Storm is quite a bit stronger than it was in 2nd edition. And some people may argue that it's too strong. I think that, just like with Translocation, I think we need time to playtest it to figure out if it is too strong. And this is really complicated stuff, and it's not how the game used to work. So a lot of people are going to be confused, and it's difficult to explain to people why it works this way. I'm still sort of wrapping my head around, and I feel like I fumbled through this whole video. But I feel like the slides do a pretty good job explaining it, even if I fumbled my words. I think this definitely needs an official explanation from Games Workshop to help understand these interactions, because they are complicated and they are not intuitive. If this is not how the game is supposed to be played, I think it needs an errata right away. No delay. Like next week would be great. And if you think that's the case, you should email Games Workshop to ask them if it's supposed to work this way or how it's supposed to work. Furthermore, I'm not a perfect person by any means. So if you think I made a mistake in my logic or my understanding of the rules, leave a comment under this video or jump into our Discord server. You can see a link to it in the video description on YouTube. I'm willing to discuss this. I feel like I've made a pretty good case here, but if somebody sees a flaw in my logic, I want to know, because I want to understand how this ability works. And there we go. That's the case I've laid out for Cycle of the Storm. So there's a lot of implications that would come as a result of it working one way or the other. I think I've made a pretty good case for it working the way I've described in this video, where you can survive an infinite amount of damage from one attack just based on the way the rules are worded. What do you think about this, JJ? Does this change your perception of any of the Lord Arcanums?
Like you were saying, I can definitely see more value in the Griff Charger Arcanum, but honestly, it just it buffs all their value at the end of the day.
Yeah, we were already using the Toralon quite a bit in our lists, and I think that's just even better now. But I think it opens up the door to a lot of lists that wouldn't otherwise exist, because if you run something like a Karazai or a Star Drake, it might just die in that first turn, and then your whole list kind of falls apart because they're so expensive. But if you bring a Cycle of the Storm, you can guarantee it lives at least one more turn, which is really, really good. All right, so that's it for this video. It was a quick one. We're still planning on putting together our video about lists. I just wanted to put this one out there and see people's opinion on what is going on exactly. If you have any questions, like I said, leave a comment or come discuss it on our Discord server. We are trying to figure this one out. So if you think you know something that we don't, come give us a hand. We can figure it out together.